Okay.
Well, I'm delighted to have Colleen Theron join me today on the Scotland Against Modern Slavery podcast. It's not often that you meet such passionate people, but it's actually their job as well. And Colleen is one of those people that, really, my interactions with her has really got me kind of enthralled and love listening to her and love talking to her about what she does and why she does it. So Colleen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Sean, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here, and likewise, I've thoroughly enjoyed the interaction we've had kind of leading up to today, and you joining us on our webinar yesterday. And I think we share a similar viewpoint about why we do this work and why it's really important to, I guess, have a victim-centric approach to a lot of the things that we do as well.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think you're spot on when you talk about that. Well, Colleen, it's Ardea. I've joined SAMS and you're one of our partners, and it's really important for me to get that across. So I think it's probably, if I ask you to tell me a little bit about who Ardea are, what is it your organisation does? Why do you exist? What's the background to this?
Thanks, that's amazing. So Ardea International was set up by me 11 years ago. It was under the auspices of a different name at the time, because my background is I'm an environmental lawyer. And when I originally set up the business, it was really to work with businesses around environmental and sustainability issues. A little bit of background as to then kind of where I've landed up with the work and perhaps also the repositioning of what used to be CLT Enviro Law is, in the work that I was doing around sustainability, I was invited by a client to go to a conference at the Legatum Institute to hear about modern slavery and human trafficking. And a bit like you, when you had your moment of, oh my word, how's this actually even happening? I had exactly the same kind of light bulb moment, where I was just horrified. I'd never heard the term before. I'd never seen what was going on. Just hadn't been aware of it. So I landed up, before the end of that conference, going to speak to some of the people on the panels and saying, look, I'm a lawyer. There must be something in terms of my skill set that I can use to perhaps try and address this crime and build things. And that led me into a journey. So at that particular time, I did some volunteering with on the side with a NGO, and I actually helped establish an NGO to raise awareness amongst business. So it was called Finance Against Trafficking. I worked as a director for some time on that. And the process then of beginning to understand what businesses didn't know and what they should know led me into this work around business and human rights as part of an umbrella of sustainability. And I just started working more closely with organizations to get to understand what their challenges were, both from a legal perspective and also from a supply chain perspective. And so Ardea International was a rebranding that we did about 5 years ago, because the banner of CLT Enviro Law just didn't make sense because we were doing more and more work in this area. And I didn't want to be pigeonholed as such as just an environmental law practice. And then I guess to answer your question, so the work that we do, we specialist business and human rights consultancy, and our expertise is very specific around modern slavery. And we work internationally, we work across sectors, really to support organizations address their legal obligations. So that might be to how they report, how they on their modern slavery statements, how they have to consider their broader reporting under the Companies Act requirements. And then increasingly, how do they develop due diligence systems so that the processes that they sit under their policy commitments are robust. And as part of all of that, we started a training program, because I think, as we spoke yesterday, it's really critical for people to become aware of it. I mean, if you hadn't gone to a course, if I hadn't been invited somewhere, we might never have known about this issue. And it's the same thing for businesses. Not all businesses are badly intentioned. It's just many of them don't actually know what the challenges are and what is out there. And that's really what we do, is we're there to work with businesses to support them to strengthen their approach to addressing modern slavery risk.
So it's specific, but it's so broad. If that's a Shan comment, but it's like, it sounds to me that you've had, this epiphany, this moment that's changed your whole career and drove you down this path. But also in the midst of that, you have this, your organisation are supporting other businesses in this. And what you said, there was a couple of things that kind of picked up on as you talked about that, you help them with putting the policies in place, give them the from a legal perspective, keeps them right, I suppose. Correct me if I'm wrong here. But then it's all very good having these policies in place, but if there's no process to make them substantial, then there's no point. You're just saying something and doing nothing about it. Does that sound about right?
That's exactly right. And I think, it's an interesting area we're suddenly moving into, Sean. I'm sure you see it too, with COP particularly. I mean, there you are in Glasgow in the midst of all of this. Yeah. There's a real sense starting, I think, about greenwashing. And, it's not enough to have a policy that looks good, that's slick, that's been sent to your designer, your graphics. We see that everywhere, and not have anything underpin it. And I must be honest that I think in my last 8 to 10 years that I've been really surprised at how few organizations have really robust processes in place. And that's not to put businesses off. It's just that is the reality. And what we need is more businesses to embrace the fact that they might potentially be exposed, that they don't really know what to do, and that they really start at least at taking a step to say, we have an objective. We want to ensure we do the right thing. We want to ensure that we are able to spot if there's modern slavery in our supply chains or that there are bad practices, and at least take that step forward. And I think, that is one of the big challenges of how you move the dial forward, is for the culture of an organization to change, to say, there's a need for this, not just, we've worked with the same agency for 25 years. There's no reason for us to go and audit them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's just, it's like, it's just understanding that having a process or having a policy in place with regards to these topics, it's about how do you manage and how do you consistently audit and review. Something you touched on, you said there, Colleen, I'll maybe take some guidance from you on this, and I get asked this from a Sam's perspective, is that, businesses may ask me, they may be very early on in their journey, and they've got a modern slavery statement or a very basic statement, as many businesses will do. But what I would say to them, and please keep me right here, Colleen, is that, this should be a living, breathing document that every year you update, you say what you're going to do, and then do it. Or if you don't do it, admit that you've not done it, but this is why you've not done it, and then say what you're going to do the following year. And if that means that you identify in your supply chain that there's a risk area that is in a certain geography or is in a certain product that's supplied to them, these are the risk areas that you've identified. Is it fair enough to say that could be the first step?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And, policy commitment is always the first step. And then there's policy honesty and continuous improvement. And I think that a lot of organizations over the years have taken the view that what they do with their modern slavery statement is they simply change the date every year, and they might add a different introduction. But what I have seen is those organizations that are willing to embrace it as a journey, a starting point, and actually also a reflection of their commitment, start using it almost as a means of how they will progress. So I've seen that we do some work with the Premier League football club, and, I've seen how we've progressed in the work that they've done in this area, where it started with next to nothing, and now they have a strategy built into their policy. So it's really clear for everyone to see what they're going to seek to achieve. But it also is clear for them internally, because what we do in ethics and compliance meetings is say, well, this is what our view was of last year. Have we managed that? What are the things that are the gaps? And how will we tackle those gaps? Or should we just all pat ourselves on the back because we've done really well, and now we can look to the next year and keep growing that?
So it's just continuous, isn't it? As you mentioned, continuous improvement. It's about having this living and breathing document and actually being substantial. And what it's funny you say that, because what you mentioned earlier on is they just change the date on their modern slavery statement and just and file it and stick it on their website and keep a hold of it in policy and documents. But actually, more and more, well, I'm finding anyway, when talking to business here in Scotland, it's not just the leaders in the business that are thinking they have to do something about it. There's pressure from within their own workforce to say, well, what are we doing about this problem? And it's visible. It's more visible, than it ever was, because we're more aware. So the pressure has come from inside, from the top, inside, and everywhere to do something.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting point around it is that we, in my career, we started off talking about sustainability and the sustainability imperative, and now, of course, it's moved into what we call the ESG, what we see everywhere around there. But I think what we are seeing in terms of when you talk about pressure is also investor pressure. I mean, for the first time, really seeing questions for especially the bigger organizations. How do they evidence what they're saying? One of my clients has had a few of those kind of queries from their auditors this year that has said, well, show us what you've done. You've said that you've done this, so give us the evidence, which is really interesting, because that, I think, will also perhaps create some real incentive for change, because if your investor, your rankings go down in terms of indexes and things, if you're a FTSE company, you're concerned about that because you can't maintain your shareholder return.
No, of course. So then it's every stakeholder involved. Can I maybe have a conversation here, Colleen, about supply chains then, because these are questions that I will get asked about. They look at this, first of all, they'll look at the first tier and they'll think, well, actually, we are not particularly at risk in our first tier, but there may be procurement done globally for products that come from geographies where there's known to be significant risk areas. And publicly available information will say that certain products are certain. So what, if they're starting out in a journey, we've had discussions before, generally about procurement and global supply chains. What should a business do if they're starting out, and they've not got anything in place? Where do they go? Where do they start?
Well, the very first place is, I would say, is to start getting an understanding of who your suppliers are. I think that's in itself. I'm interested to see what a challenge that is for some organizations. They think they know who their suppliers are, but they don't hold the data in one place. So, understanding who your suppliers are and then determining a risk profile of how you might then go and assess them more closely is a really good starting point. And one of the things I would say from, my own journey in as my own understanding and knowledge growth in this area has happened working with so many organizations of different sizes in different places, is that it's really critical for an organization that's starting to think about what that data platform might be that they're using to assess their suppliers and to hold the information, because there's two reasons for it. One is visibility, so that, it's not held in a spreadsheet in your, Sean's got it and Sean can't come to work for the next 3 months because he had an accident on his bicycle. So how do we even get to that stuff? So it's the visibility is the one piece. The other piece is that if you are able to assess your suppliers, you need to be able to monitor the responses. And that is still a really big area that's, has to, I think, be addressed in the next 5 years, because we have KPIs, we have supplier codes of conduct, but very few companies are doing any kind of monitoring on their suppliers' responses and where they are. And so, when they start on their journey, it's worthwhile thinking about how would they put in a system where they can not only assess the risk in their supply chain, but also monitor it. Okay. So what is the scope of that?
And so it's again, I'm going back to the start of our conversation, is about the policies and the process, isn't it? And having that substantial process and to continually monitor what's happening in the supply chain. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and the other part I think of it is, the question about training and capacity building, because, again, people's roles are often quite siloed in a company. And, when you're dealing with something like modern slavery risk, it is a risk that is cross-cutting. It's, your purchasing practices, your employment practices, what you pay people, your legal practices, what is the legal requirements that you meet, what are the terms and conditions you write into your contracts with your suppliers and with your employees. So actually, you really need to work out how you break down the silos. And training is really critical. And I think that's why it was one of the reporting criteria put into the Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Statement, Modern Slavery Transparency Supply Chains provisions, is because training is such a pivotal part of raising awareness and then for people to take ownership of how this actually pertains to their particular role.
So, two key parts to what we're talking about here is 3 is policy, process, and training. Would that be a fair way to summarise how you would look at it?
Yeah, I think there would be one fourth thing I'd put in there. And for me, increasingly, it's...
Sorry, excuse the siren. It's
okay. Is it gone?
Passing it.
Okay. I think, Sean, we need to think about leadership. We need to think about culture and the cultural side of doing the right thing, because the programs that or the companies that really get their heads around this and start showing leadership, changing stuff, will generally have someone at the top who really has bought into the why this is important and will reflect that in how they maintain resources, what expertise they put in place, how they speak about it, how they reference it. And I think that that's also what we're needing more of, if we're honest. We look at the low levels of compliance still for addressing modern slavery, even just in terms of the reporting standards. I think that, having leaders in place who are really committed to doing the right thing might change the dial a bit.
And I think this is probably a good topic for me to kind of stick here. My view on this is because there's from a leadership perspective, and we've got 4 areas that you're talking about in leadership. Probably, there's no getting away from it. If if the people at the top of the business don't believe in what they're doing, if it's just a tick box exercise, it's fundamentally not going to work. And I look at this from 2 angles, Colleen, and you can maybe help me with this, but I look at it as that there's a human, and we'll talk about survivors and victims becoming survivors shortly, but there's a human side to this, and we see across the UK, we see it in Scotland, that the numbers of victims that have been rescued are increasing dramatically. Globally, we know there's a massive issue, in particular in certain geographies, and a lot of the everyday products that we may buy, we still don't know how that labour is functioning, and there's no getting away from that. So the human side of it is on one side, and the flip side is from the leadership of a business, that business leaders will look at it and go, of course, the human side's part of it, but it's also the brand damage that can come out of the other end of something that breaks in their supply chain. And how far can a business offload responsibility? Well, they can't really, can they, Colleen? Is that fair enough to say?
Well, I mean, I think, we were talking about this yesterday a little bit, weren't we? Is that actually the reality is that, businesses will always try and de-risk their operations in terms of contracts, in terms of, supply chain management, all the other things. But now we see as well that, civil society is not shying away from holding big corporates liable, or at least bringing them to court. So they are running after the brands, even if, something happens way down in the supply chain. Like, a good example is actually, the illegal fishing of prawns.
Yeah.
I mean, Nestle was caught up in a legal case in the States because an action was brought saying they'd misrepresented in their products, which was IM's cat foods, that there was actually an ingredient that had been obtained through forced labor, and that ingredient was shrimps, which had come from Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
So, that is a good example of, something's happened way down in your supply chain, it's in your product, and now you're having to account for it in the courts, which is going to cost you thousands and thousands of pounds in legal defense and your time with your directors and managing your reputation. I mean, the interesting thing in that particular case is Nestle actually did get the case dismissed, and the basis for the dismissal was because their policies and processes were seen to be robust and seen to be talking about the fact that they never tried to say they'd got it right. They said they were trying to set it right, and it was really pivotal that the court looked at that intention and threw it out. But I think you're right. I mean, that the civil society and what's going on is not going to diminish in terms of coming after brands from a reputational point of view if something is happening and they can be attached to a particular brand.
Mm-hmm. And there's no getting away from that, because you're a business maybe in the supply chain of a larger organization, or it could be the end user in the sense of it's a retailer or whatever that product is. There's the complexities of that, but the huge amount of brand damage, and it's very hard to come back. You've mentioned there about Nestle, and I think it sounds like they had a very good defence, but there's very hard to come back, and we probably won't talk about some of the UK names that have been affected by this, but they're openly talked about some of the issues that have recurred, or the cases that have recurred, and there's a civil case being carried out by some victims of human trafficking that were rescued through Operation Fort, that that they're taking against a recruitment business and the end customer as well, in business, and that'll be fairly public, I'm sure, through time. I think as Colleen, we talked about survivors and about individuals, and you also talked about your story at this turning point. You had what you were doing, you ended up somewhere, and this just turned the whole way that you think you live, everything you do, the passion that's come out of all of this. It sounds to me that you're a very driven person. In any interaction I've had with you, the passion from you you can just feel it, it just comes right out of you. Is it, you've turned your whole life into your business has become a passion of yours. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I would say so. So would everyone else.
So yeah, I'm sure your team will say that, and anyone that has interactions with you. But it comes through, Colleen, and it's lovely to see. It shines so brightly through your personality and any interactions that you have with you. And I see that's the one topic or the one area in commerce and in business where business can do something. I've got to say, I'm going to be really brutal. When GDPR came around, I found it the most boring topic in the world. But it was compliance, had to be done, had to be processed, had to be policies and compliance. But even the four letters, I don't even know. It's just.
I agree.
So and it was a big topic, and it went on for a long time, and it was the run up to it and the implementation, all the rest of it. But this is something about human beings, and this is something that we can have an effect on. And I get from you as a qualified lawyer, you've chosen to take the law and use it in a positive sense, right? What drives you to do that, Colleen? That's something that stands out.
Well, I mean, if I'm really honest, I'll say to you one thing that does drive me is faith. So I have a strong faith, I have a Christian faith, is a real cool part of me. But I think it is very much around, that every one of us has an opportunity to do something positive. Every one of us has an opportunity every day to make a decision. Are you going to be kind? How are you going to interact into the people you do? And I feel on a very personal basis as well that I have a great responsibility. I'm privileged enough to have been educated. I live in the Western country. I live in a place where I freely can go to work. I can freely do things. And that gives me a responsibility that, the people who don't have that, and sometimes are, not all of the time, but most of the time, are the victims of exploitation, and the victims are, and the kind of places they find themselves in is just horrendous. And I feel that, that is what we should, well, I wouldn't say everyone, but I would hope so, is that actually for all of us, if you can have a sense that you can make a difference, that's part of the drive. Like this has been a very hard business to run. I mean, I'll be quite frank with you. I felt more often than not I would shut it, because trying to persuade businesses to do the right thing is extremely difficult. They don't want to go to lawyers to pay them to do the right thing. They want to go to a lawyer when they're in a mess. And that's not what we're doing. We are saying, okay, if you're in a mess, we can help you. But actually, we're here to really strengthen your approach, to get you to a place where you can evidence in a leadership position that you care about not only your individual employees, but all of the people that you work for. Now, I know that's very philosophical, and, sometimes people listening to this will think, well, what planet does this girl live on? Is she a lawyer? Doesn't she understand about profits and that? Of course I do. But it's in answer to your question, that I guess for me, it's always been that drive, that because I'm passionate about this, and because when you see that a life can be turned around, and what difference it makes where people are able to come alongside someone, which, I mean, you do, Sean, with your work, and that if you can come alongside someone and you can see their lives turning and changing, that's very empowering, more than anything else. And actually, I've just written a chapter for a book on how businesses play a role in both the exploitation and rehabilitation of survivors of trafficking. And I think actually you contributed to that as some examples. But you look at those case studies where actually, people's lives have been really tangibly turned around by the power of business, because it has that power because of its influence. That's an exciting place to be. So, I see myself as a facilitator of change, and, hopefully, as you say, to use the law in a way that, really makes a difference.
That's a story. That's a story and a half, Colleen. And that, do you know what? I'm glad that you opened up and spoke about that, because you've got something inside you that's driving you, and it comes out as passion. And I think that passion has been used in the right way to help those that need help in our society more than anything. And I think, you've quite eloquently put it, for me, eloquently than I have put it, but it's a strong belief of mine as well. It doesn't matter what you do, what your job is, or what you're on this earth to do a little bit more than just work, in my head. And by doing your work, so what you're doing your work is actually helping people, helping businesses. But in the bigger picture of this, you're helping those individuals that are really at the lowest end of, I don't know, they're of society, if that makes sense, and they need that support. And it won't just come from, it needs to come from all areas of society, and you're helping businesses play their part in that.
Yeah, and I mean, on a personal level as well, I grappled for some time as to whether actually I'd be better working in an NGO, or even creating a foundation, working at like much more frontline stuff. But I realized that I'm blessed with a skill set that is quite unique, but in the sense of, understanding the law, being able to apply it. And actually, if it's used in a way that can affect change, that's quite powerful. And an example, last year I worked with an organization that, issued contracts to its workers in a supply chain, which had never, ever had those contracts before. And if you flip side that, each person receiving a contract that gives them the right to work, that gives them the right to be paid of a certain amount of money, the right to holidays, the right to sick pay, that changes an individual's life. And it's that kind of thing that makes me excited, because that means there's impact in the work that we're doing.
Fantastic. Colleen, that's such an enjoyable discussion that I've had with you today. You've enlightened me, and I'm sure many people listening will be delighted to hear what you've spoken about. I'm going to, just as we close up, as you've probably heard, as people are listening, plenty of traffic and noise on in Glasgow. I'm not far off the main road here in Glasgow, in one of the main roads in Glasgow city centre. A noisy city, much noisier when COP was going on, I must say.
I'm sure.
But is it? I understand that you lived in Glasgow, didn't you, for a while?
I did. It rained every single day except for 4. I couldn't bear it.
And I don't think that's ever changed. So yes, a very wet place and cold at this point in time. But yeah. Well, we're delighted to have had you on the Scotland Against Modern Slavery podcast. And the fact that you have lived in Glasgow, you're an honorary citizen of this city, and therefore you're entitled to come up and visit anytime you want.
I'd love that. I'd love that. It's a fabulous. The people were wonderful. It was only the weather that got the better of me.
Well, Colleen, Theron from Ardea, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the privilege. Thank you. Take care.